The wagon wheel cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and Marianne Holt knew in that instant her world was about to shatter. "Papa, the wheel!" she screamed over the dust storm that had been battering their wagon train for the past 3 hours. But her voice was swallowed by the howling wind that seemed determined to bury them all in red Utah soil. Her father, his face weathered and grim, fought to control the panicked horses as the wagon lurched sideways. Marianne gripped the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white, her younger sister Sarah clinging to her arm with desperate fingers. The year was 1878, and they had been traveling from Missouri to California for nearly 3 months, following the promise of fertile land and new opportunities. The dust was so thick Marianne could barely see the other wagons ahead of them. One moment they were there, dark shapes moving through the russet clouds, and the next they had vanished entirely. The broken wheel dragged through the hard-packed earth, slowing their wagon to a crawl while the storm raged around them. "We need to stop," her mother shouted from inside the covered wagon, her voice high with fear. But stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind in a dust storm meant losing the train entirely. Marianne's father knew it as well as she did. She could see the terrible calculation in his eyes, the same eyes that had looked upon her mother with such tenderness just that morning. The wagon shuddered and came to a halt. The broken wheel had given up completely, splintering into pieces that scattered across the desert floor. Marianne's father jumped down, disappearing into the swirling dust. She heard him shouting, trying to signal the other wagons, but the wind carried his words away like fallen leaves. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was hours. Time became meaningless in that suffocating cloud of earth and sky. Sarah was crying now, her face buried in Marianne's shoulder. At 19 years old, Marianne was only 4 years older than her sister, but in that moment she felt ancient, carrying the weight of knowing what was about to happen. When the dust finally began to settle, revealing a landscape painted in shades of bronze and shadow, the wagon train was gone. Disappeared beyond the horizon like a dream upon waking. Only their broken wagon remained, tilted at an awkward angle, a monument to their misfortune. Marianne's father stood 50 yards away, his hat in his hands, staring at the empty trail ahead. Her mother emerged from the wagon, her face pale beneath the layer of dust that coated them all. "They left us," Sarah whispered, as though saying it quietly would make it less true. "They had to keep moving," Marianne's mother said, but her voice trembled. "They will send help back for us." They all knew it was a lie. The wagon master had been clear from the beginning. Anyone who could not keep pace would be left behind. The wilderness had no mercy for stragglers, and neither did those who had learned to survive it. They made camp there, beside their broken wagon, and waited. One day became 2, 2 became 4. The water barrels that had seemed so plentiful grew lighter with each sunset. Marianne rationed the hardtack and dried beef, making calculations that kept her awake through the cold desert nights. On the morning of the 5th day, her father announced his decision. "I am going to walk to Parowan. It cannot be more than 20 miles south. I will bring back help, a new wheel, whatever we need." "You cannot go alone," Marianne's mother protested. "Someone must stay with the wagon." "With the girls." His voice was final, the voice he used when his mind was set and no argument would sway him. He left before noon, carrying one of their precious water canteens and a rifle. Marianne watched him walk south until he became a speck, then a memory, then nothing at all. 3 more days passed. The water was nearly gone. Sarah had stopped crying and started staring at nothing, her lips cracked and bleeding. Marianne's mother moved through their small camp like a ghost, touching things without purpose, her mind somewhere far away. On the 8th day, when the morning sun painted the desert gold, Marianne's mother made her own announcement. "I am taking Sarah and walking back the way we came. Perhaps we can catch another wagon train or find a settlement we passed." "Mama, that is madness," Marianne said, though her voice came out as a whisper. "We passed nothing for days before the storm. I will not sit here and wait to die." Her mother's eyes were wild, desperate. "You can come with us or you can wait for your father, but Sarah and I are leaving." Marianne looked at her sister, saw the vacant expression, the sunburned skin, the trembling hands. She looked at her mother, at the determination born of panic rather than reason, and she made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I will wait for Papa," she said. Her mother did not argue. Perhaps she had not expected Marianne to come anyway. Perhaps she had already left her eldest daughter behind in her mind. They took the last full canteen of water, some dried food, and Marianne's father's second rifle. They walked east as the sun climbed higher, and Marianne stood beside the broken wagon and watched them go. She was alone. The silence was worse than the dust storm had been. At least the storm had been something, a presence, a force to struggle against. This silence was an absence, a void that pressed against her ears until she thought she might scream just to fill it. Marianne was practical by nature. Her grandmother had raised her to be sensible, to face problems with clear eyes and steady hands. So she took inventory of what remained. Half a canteen of water that her mother had left behind, probably out of guilt. A small amount of dried beef and hardtack. The wagon itself, though broken. The horses, though they had wandered off the second day, drawn by some instinct toward water she could not sense. A rifle with 12 bullets, a knife, the clothes on her back and one extra dress, a blanket, a tin pot, matches that were worth more than gold. She could survive perhaps 4 more days if she was careful, 5 if she was lucky. After that, the desert would claim her, but Marianne Holt had not survived 19 years of hardscrabble farming, bitter winters, and her grandmother's stern teachings to simply lie down and die. If death was coming for her, it would have to work for the privilege. She spent the first day alone organizing everything she had, creating a shelter using the tilted wagon and her blanket to block the worst of the afternoon sun. She caught a lizard and could not bring herself to eat it, but she kept it in a tin cup anyway, watching it scrabble against the metal sides. Perhaps tomorrow she would be hungry enough. The second day, she walked in careful circles around her camp, looking for anything useful. She found nothing but rocks and scrub brush and the endless expanse of red earth that stretched to every horizon. But she did see something that made her heart leap. A thin trail of dust to the south, moving slowly. Riders, coming from the direction of Parowan. She ran back to camp and built a fire, feeding it green brush to make it smoke. She waved her blanket, she shouted until her throat was raw. She did everything she could think of to signal them. But the riders never changed course. They passed by miles to the east, close enough to give her hope but too far away to see her desperate signals. When they disappeared beyond the horizon, Marianne sat down in the dirt and cried for the first time since her family had left her. The third day began with the last mouthful of water from her canteen. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue felt too large for her mouth. She had eaten the lizard the night before, raw and terrible, and it sat in her stomach like a stone. She knew she was going to die. The acceptance came quietly, without drama. She would die here beside this broken wagon, and eventually someone would find her bones. Or perhaps the desert would bury her, covering all evidence that she had ever existed. Perhaps that would be better. She lay down in the shade of the wagon and closed her eyes. The heat pressed down on her like a physical weight. Somewhere far away, a hawk cried out, hunting. The sound seemed to come from another world, one where living things still had the strength to hunt and cry and exist. She must have slept, or perhaps she was already dying, because when she opened her eyes the sun had moved and there was a shadow standing over her that had not been there before. The shadow was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, backlit by the afternoon sun so that she could not see his face. For a moment she thought it was her father, returned at last with help from Parowan. But something was wrong. The shape was wrong, the posture too still, too watchful. "Water," she tried to say, but no sound came out. The man knelt beside her, and she saw his face. He was young, perhaps 25, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face was tanned and weathered from the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting at long horizons. He wore dusty trail clothes and a hat that had seen better years. He uncorked a canteen and lifted it to her lips. The water was warm and tasted of leather, and it was the most beautiful thing Marianne had ever experienced. She drank greedily, desperately, until he pulled the canteen away. "Slow," he said. His voice was deep and quiet with an accent that placed him somewhere from Texas. "You will make yourself sick." "More," she managed to whisper, "in a minute. Let that settle first." He sat back on his heels, studying her with those calm green eyes. "How long have you been out here?" 11 days, I think, maybe 12. The numbers felt uncertain, as though they belonged to someone else's story. He looked at the broken wagon, at her meager camp, at the empty desert surrounding them. "Alone?" "Now, yes." The words came easier with the water in her. "The wagon train left us when the wheel broke. My father went to Parowan for help. My mother and sister went back east. Nobody came back." Something flickered across his face there and gone too quickly to read. "When did they leave?" "Father 8 days ago. Mother and sister 3 days ago." He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence Marianne heard her own death sentence. 8 days was too long. Her father was not coming back. Whether he had died on the trail, reached Parowan and abandoned her, or simply gotten lost, the result was the same. He was gone. "What is your name?" the man asked. "Marianne Holt." "Frank Norton." He held out his hand, formal despite the circumstances, and she shook it with fingers that trembled. "I have a ranch about 6 miles west of here. I was tracking a lost calf and saw your wagon from a ridge. Thought it might be empty or raiders, but figured I should check anyway." "Thank God you did." He gave her more water, small sips that brought her back from the edge bit by bit. Then he stood and surveyed her camp with a practiced eye. "Can you ride?" "I think so. I am going to take you back to my ranch. You can recover there, and then we will figure out what to do next. Does that sound acceptable?" Marianne almost laughed at the formality of it, at this stranger asking permission after saving her life. "Yes. Yes, that sounds acceptable." He had a horse waiting beyond a small rise, a big roan gelding with patient eyes. Frank lifted her onto the saddle with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. She was too weak to feel embarrassed about the intimacy of it, about being pressed against a stranger's chest with his arms around her to hold the reins. "What about my things?" she asked as they started to move. "I will come back for them tomorrow. Right now we need to get you out of this sun." The ride to his ranch was a blur of heat and exhaustion. She drifted in and out of awareness, held steady by Frank's arm around her waist. She caught impressions. Red rock formations rising like cathedrals, a dry creek bed winding between hills, the sudden appearance of green where a spring fed a small meadow, and then buildings, rough but solid, arranged around a dusty yard. A barn, a corral, a small house made of wood and stone. Chickens scattered at their approach. A dog barked once, then came running with its tail wagging. Frank dismounted and lifted her down, and her legs buckled immediately. He caught her before she fell, then simply picked her up and carried her toward the house. "I have got you," he said quietly. "You are safe now." Safe. The word was strange to her, foreign, something she had not felt in so long that she had forgotten the shape of it. He carried her inside and laid her on a narrow bed in a small bedroom. The room was spare but clean, with whitewashed walls and a window that faced west. He brought her water, bread soaked in milk that was easy to swallow, and a damp cloth to wipe the dust from her face. "There is a woman who lives on the neighboring ranch," he said. "Mrs. Patterson. I will ride over and ask her to come check on you. She knows more about nursing than I do. Please do not leave." The words came out before Marianne could stop them, childish and desperate. Frank paused at the door. "I will be 2 hours at most. You have water there by the bed and food. The door locks from the inside if it would make you feel safer. But I give you my word, you are safe in my home." She believed him. She was not sure why, but she did. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness in his voice or the gentle way he had carried her, or simply that she had no choice but to trust him. He had saved her life. What reason would he have to harm her now? He left, and she was alone in the silence again. But this silence was different. It was the silence of thick walls and a roof overhead, of safety and shelter. She sipped the water, ate a little bread, and let herself relax for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. When she woke, late afternoon sunlight was streaming through the window and a woman was sitting in a chair beside the bed. "Oh, good, you are awake," the woman said with a warm smile. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and capable hands. "I am Dorothy Patterson. Frank told me about finding you. You poor dear. What an ordeal, Mrs." Patterson checked her over with practiced efficiency, making her drink more water, examining her sunburned skin and cracked lips, asking questions about pain and dizziness. Finally, she sat back with a satisfied nod. "You will be fine with rest and food. You are young and strong, thank the Lord." Another day or two, and it might have been a different story. "Where is Frank?" "Tending to the animals. He ran the poor horse hard getting to my place and back." She stood and smoothed her skirts. "I brought some of my daughter's old dresses for you. Yours are not fit for wearing anymore, I am afraid. We are about the same size, you and Emily. I will leave them on the chair here. Thank you for coming, for the dresses, for everything." "Nonsense. We help each other out here. It is the only way to survive." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Frank is a good man, one of the best. You are fortunate he found you, I know." Over the next few days, Marianne slowly regained her strength. Mrs. Patterson visited daily, bringing food and company and news from the wider world. Frank was a quiet presence, there at meals and in the evenings, but giving her space to recover. She learned that he had come to Utah 5 years ago from Texas, following a dream of his own ranch. He had built this place with his own hands, every board and nail, working as a cowboy for other ranchers until he had saved enough to buy his own land and cattle. He had no wife, no family nearby, just himself and this ranch and the big sky overhead. "Why did you never marry?" Marianne asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the rocks red and gold. Frank was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I never found the right woman. Or maybe the right woman never found me. Out here, there are not many choices. And I have been too busy building this place to go looking. It must be lonely. Sometimes. But I like the quiet, I like the work, and I always figured if it was meant to happen, it would happen in its own time." He glanced at her, then away. "What about you?" 19 and unmarried is not so common. "My grandmother died 2 years ago. She raised me after my mother. Well, my mother was never quite right in the head after I was born. The doctor said it happens sometimes with women. My father married her when I was 3, gave me his name, gave Sarah a mother. We were a family, or close enough to one, but there was never time for courting or thinking about marriage. Always work to do, crops to tend. And then we decided to go to California. You think they made it? Your father, your mother and sister. It was the question she had been avoiding, the thought she pushed away whenever it surfaced. I do not know. Part of me wants to believe they are out there somewhere safe. But part of me knows that if my father had made it to Parowan, he would have sent help back. He was not a perfect man, but he was not the kind to abandon his daughter. Something must have happened to him. I asked around in town, Frank said quietly, when I went to get your things from the wagon. No one matching his description has come through. I am sorry. The grief hit her then, sudden and overwhelming. She had been holding it at bay with practicalities and recovery, but now it crashed over her like a wave. She cried for her father, lost somewhere in this harsh land. For her mother and sister, walking east into emptiness with desperation as their only guide. For the family she had lost one way or another, Frank did not say anything, did not try to comfort her with empty words. He just sat beside her on the porch and let her cry, his presence solid and steady in the gathering darkness. A week passed, then two. Marianne grew stronger each day, helping with chores around the ranch, cooking meals, tending the vegetable garden that struggled in the harsh soil. It felt good to work, to be useful, to have purpose again, but she knew she could not stay forever. Frank had saved her life and given her shelter, but this was his home, not hers. Eventually they would have to discuss what came next. The conversation came on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after he had found her. They were washing dishes after supper, working side by side in the small kitchen. I have been thinking, Frank said, his hands still in the soapy water, about what happens next. For you, I mean. I have been thinking about it too. You could go to Parowan. There might be work there, a family that needs help. Or I could give you money for a stagecoach to Salt Lake City. There would be more opportunities there. Marianne dried a plate slowly, carefully. Is that what you want? For me to leave? Want? He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. No, that is not what I want, but I will not keep you here against your will, and I will not have people thinking I am taking advantage of your situation. What do you want, Frank? He pulled his hands from the water and dried them on a towel, taking his time, choosing his words. I want you to stay. I want to wake up and hear you singing in the kitchen. I want to sit on the porch with you and watch the sunset. I want to build a life with someone instead of just surviving alone. He took a breath. I want you, Marianne, but only if that is what you want too. She set down the plate and turned to face him fully. I am not the same girl who left Missouri 3 months ago. The desert burned that person away. I do not know who I am now, not really. I just know that when I am here with you, I feel less lost. I feel like maybe I could build a new life, a different life than the one I was heading toward. Is that a yes? It is a yes to staying, to seeing where this goes, to building something together. She smiled, tentative. Is that enough? It is everything. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break, and maybe she was. Maybe they both were. Two people who had been alone for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something bigger than themselves. The kiss deepened, became more certain. His hands cupped her face, gentle despite their calluses. She wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself fall into the moment, into the feeling of being wanted, being chosen, being home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Frank rested his forehead against hers. We should do this properly. Court like respectable people. Let you be sure. I am sure. You say that now, but give it time. Let me prove myself to you. So they courted there on that isolated ranch 6 miles from nowhere. Frank brought her wildflowers he found in the high meadows. They rode together in the evenings, exploring the land that would become hers too. He taught her to rope cattle and mend fences. She taught him that meals could be more than burnt meat and stale bread. Mrs. Patterson visited often, serving as chaperone and friend and conspirator all at once. "I knew from the moment I saw you two together," she said one afternoon as she and Marianne shelled peas on the porch. "The way he looked at you. Frank has always been so self-sufficient, so contained, but with you he is different, softer somehow, happier. I feel the same way. Like I found something I did not know I was looking for. That is how it is supposed to be. My Henry was like that for me." She smiled at some distant memory. Love is not always lightning and thunder. Sometimes it is just finding someone who makes the hard work of living feel worthwhile. 3 months after Frank found her in the desert, he asked her to marry him properly. They were sitting by the creek that ran through his property, watching the stars emerge in the vast darkening sky. "I know we have not known each other long," he said, "but I know my own mind, and I know my heart. Marianne Holt, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in Parowan a week later, in a small church with Mrs. Patterson and her husband as witnesses. Marianne wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew. Frank wore his best suit, the one he had brought from Texas and never had occasion to use. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and when Frank kissed her this time, it was not tentative or careful. It was the kiss of a man claiming his future, and Marianne kissed him back with the same fierce certainty. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, in the small bedroom where she had first woken to find herself saved. Frank was gentle with her, patient, teaching her the language of intimacy with careful hands and whispered words. She had been nervous, but with him it felt natural, right, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I never thought I would have this," Frank said quietly. "A wife, a home that feels complete. I thought I would always be alone." "You saved my life," Marianne said. "And then you gave me a reason to live it. How do I ever repay that? You just did. By saying yes, by being here, by choosing me." "Always," she promised. "I will always choose you." The first year of marriage was an education in partnership. The ranch demanded constant work, and Marianne threw herself into it with determination. She learned to read the weather, to predict when rain might come and when drought would stretch on endlessly. She learned which cattle were trouble and which were gentle. She learned to shoot accurately, because predators did not respect property lines. Frank was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish when she made mistakes. And she taught him things too, ways to make the house more comfortable, how to preserve food for winter, the value of planning ahead instead of just reacting to problems as they arose. They worked side by side, building something bigger than either of them alone could have managed. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. They bought more cattle, improved the water system, built a better barn. But the best moments were the quiet ones, the evenings on the porch, the early mornings before the work began when they could just exist together. Frank would read aloud from the newspaper he fetched from town, his voice rumbling through articles about distant politics and closer concerns. Marianne would sew or mend, her hands always busy, but her attention on him. Sometimes he would stop reading and just look at her, his expression soft with wonder as though he still could not quite believe she was real. "What?" she would ask, smiling. "Nothing. Everything. You." In the spring of their second year together, Marianne realized she was pregnant. The morning sickness came first, then the tender breasts, then the way her dresses began to tighten around the middle. She waited until she was certain before telling Frank. She chose an evening in May when the desert was blooming with unexpected wildflowers after a rare wet winter. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set in ribbons of orange and pink. "I have something to tell you," she said. Frank set down the bridle he had been mending and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" "I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her and she could not read his expression. Then a smile broke across his face, wide and genuine and full of joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." He said it like he was testing the words, learning their shape. "When?" "November, I think, maybe early December." He pulled back to look at her, his hands cupping her face. "Are you happy? Is this what you want?" "More than anything. I want to build a family with you, Frank. A real family, the kind I never quite had growing up." "Then that is what we will do. Whatever you need, whatever the baby needs, we will make it happen." The pregnancy was difficult at first. Marianne was sick most mornings, and the summer heat made her exhausted in ways she had never experienced. But Frank was attentive, taking over more of the heavy work, making sure she rested, bringing her water flavored with mint from the garden. Mrs. Patterson visited often, full of advice and reassurance. "Every pregnancy is different," she said. "But you are strong and healthy. You will do just fine." As summer faded into fall and her belly grew round and prominent, Marianne found herself thinking about her mother and sister, wondering if they had survived, if they had made it back to civilization. Wondering if her mother had ever held Sarah's children, if Sarah had married, if they ever thought of the daughter and sister they had left behind in the desert. She mentioned it to Frank one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her swollen stomach. "You ever wish you had closure?" he asked, really knowing what happened to them, sometimes. "But I think I have made my peace with not knowing. They made their choices and I made mine. I could be angry about being left behind, but that anger would poison what I have now. And what I have now is too precious to let bitterness ruin it." "You are wiser than I am," Frank said quietly. "If I were in your place, I think I would struggle to forgive that." "I did not say I forgave them. I said I made my peace with it. Those are different things." He kissed her temple. "Fair enough." The baby came early, on a cold night in late November when snow was threatening in the heavy clouds overhead. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Marianne was certain she would not survive it. Mrs. Patterson stayed with her throughout, along with the midwife from Parowan, a stern woman named Mrs. Chen who had delivered half the babies in Iron County. Frank paced outside for hours, and when Mrs. Patterson finally emerged to tell him he had a son, he nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see her? Is she all right?" "She is exhausted but fine, and the baby is healthy and loud. Come meet your son." Frank entered the bedroom like he was walking into a church, reverent and slightly awed. Marianne lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but glowing. And in her arms, wrapped in a blanket Mrs. Patterson had knitted, was a tiny red-faced creature with dark hair and furious fists. "He is perfect," Frank whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You want to hold him." Frank took the baby with shaking hands, cradling him like he might shatter. The baby stopped crying and blinked up at him with unfocused eyes, and Frank fell in love all over again. "What should we name him?" Marianne asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, one name seemed to rise above the others. "Thomas," Frank said. "After my father, if that suits you." "Thomas Norton. It sounds strong, I like it." Thomas was a fussy baby, crying often and sleeping in short bursts that left both parents exhausted. But he was also beautiful and perfect, and watching Frank with him made Marianne fall even more deeply in love with her husband. Frank was patient with the baby in a way he was not with much else in life. He would walk Thomas around the house for hours when he was crying, singing old cowboy songs in his deep voice until the baby finally settled. He changed diapers without complaint, got up for night feedings even though there was nothing he could do but keep Marianne company, and stared at his son like he was witnessing a miracle. "I never knew I could love something this much," he admitted one night as he rocked Thomas back to sleep. "It is almost frightening how much I love him, and you. I know exactly what you mean." As Thomas grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. They had good years and hard years, seasons of plenty and seasons of drought, but they weathered it all together. Frank expanded their herd, and Marianne started raising chickens not just for eggs but to sell at market. They saved money slowly but steadily, planning for the future, for Thomas's education, for the security that had eluded both of them in their younger years. When Thomas was 3, Marianne became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps just because her body had done it before. She continued working through most of it, only slowing down in the final months when her belly became too unwieldy for the more strenuous tasks. Their second child was born on a warm spring morning in April, arriving so quickly that there was barely time to fetch the midwife. This time it was a daughter, smaller and calmer than Thomas had been, with Marianne's dark hair and Frank's green eyes. They named her Caroline after Frank's mother. With 2 children, the small ranch house felt cramped. So Frank spent that summer building an addition, 2 new bedrooms and a larger kitchen, with Marianne planning every detail. It was hard work, especially with 2 young children to care for, but when it was finished, they had a real home, a place that could hold their growing family. Thomas was a wild child, always running, always exploring, always finding new ways to give his parents heart attacks. Caroline was quieter, more thoughtful, content to sit with Marianne and help with small tasks or play with her rag dolls. Frank adored them both equally but differently, roughhousing with Thomas and being infinitely gentle with Caroline. Watching him with their children, Marianne sometimes thought about the lonely cowboy who had found her in the desert all those years ago, and she marveled at the transformation love had wrought in him. But life was not without its difficulties. In the summer of 1885, a drought hit southern Utah harder than any in recent memory. The creek that ran through their property dwindled to a trickle, then dried up entirely. The cattle grew thin, and several died despite Frank's best efforts to keep them watered from the well. Money grew tight. They sold what cattle they could, but prices were low because everyone was selling. They ate sparingly, rationed everything, and prayed for rain that did not come. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Frank and Marianne sat at the kitchen table reviewing their finances. The numbers were not good. "We might have to sell some of the land," Frank said, his voice heavy. "The northern section, maybe. The Pattersons have been talking about expanding." "No," Marianne's voice was firm. "This land is our children's future. We will find another way." "What other way?" "We have already cut everything we can cut. We are barely making it as it is. I can take in sewing. There are families in Parowan who would pay for alterations and mending, and we can sell more eggs, maybe some of the vegetables if I can keep the garden going. We do not need much, Frank. Just enough to get through until the drought breaks." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had survived abandonment and the desert itself, who had built a life from nothing, who refused to give up even when giving up would be easier. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said quietly. "No, I am just stubborn. There is a difference." They laughed together, the tension breaking, and then they made plans. Concrete, practical plans that might actually work. Marianne did take in sewing, and she was good at it, good enough that word spread and she had more work than she could handle. The money was not much, but it was enough. Combined with Frank's work breaking horses for other ranchers and the sale of eggs and vegetables, they made it through the drought. When the rains finally came the following spring, turning the desert green almost overnight, they stood together in the downpour, laughing and crying and thanking God for the blessing of water. The years rolled on, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew tall and strong with his father's work ethic and his mother's determination. Caroline grew beautiful and clever, always reading, always asking questions about the world beyond their ranch. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank gave Marianne a gift, a new dress, dark blue silk ordered all the way from Salt Lake City. It was the finest thing she had ever owned, completely impractical for ranch life, absolutely perfect. "Frank Norton, we cannot afford this," she said, even as she held the dress against her body, feeling the cool slide of silk. "Maybe not. But you deserve it. You deserve more than I can give you, honestly. But this, at least, I could manage." She kissed him then, long and deep, and later that night after the children were asleep, she wore the silk dress for him and nothing else, and they made love like newlyweds, hungry and desperate and utterly devoted to each other. When Thomas was 12 and Caroline 9, Marianne became pregnant for the third time. It was unexpected, a surprise that left both of them reeling. "I thought we were finished having children," Frank said, though he was smiling when he said it. Apparently God had different plans. This pregnancy was difficult in ways the others had not been. Marianne was 31 now, not 19, and her body protested the demands being placed on it. She was tired constantly, her back ached, and the baby sat so heavy she could barely walk by the final month. But when their third child was born in February of 1889, another son, all the discomfort was forgotten. They named him James, and he was perfect, with a head full of dark curls and lungs that could wake the dead. Thomas and Caroline were enthralled with their baby brother. Caroline wanted to help with everything, changing diapers and fetching bottles, playing mother. Thomas was more reserved but would sit and hold James sometimes, marveling at how small he was. "Was I really this tiny once?" he asked. "Even tinier," Frank told him. "You could fit in one of my hands." That is hard to believe. With 3 children and a thriving ranch, life was full and busy and loud. The quiet intimacy that had defined Frank and Marianne's early years together was harder to find now, stolen in moments between children's demands and ranch work and the thousand small tasks that made up their days. But they made time for each other, even if it was just a few minutes on the porch after everyone else was asleep, sitting close and talking about nothing important. Those moments were sacred, a reminder that beneath everything else, they were still Frank and Marianne, still the lonely cowboy and the abandoned girl who had found each other in the desert. In the summer of 1892, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was delivered by the postal carrier who made irregular runs out to the ranches surrounding Parowan. Marianne accepted it with curiosity, turning the envelope over in her hands. She did not recognize the handwriting, and the return address was from somewhere in Nevada. She opened it at the kitchen table while Frank worked outside and the children played in the yard. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in shaky handwriting. "Dear Marianne," it began, "I do not know if this letter will reach you, or if you will even read it if it does. I do not know if you are alive or dead, married or alone, happy or bitter. But I am writing anyway because I need you to know the truth of what happened, even if you never forgive me for it. Your father died 2 days after he left you." We found his body when Sarah and I walked back along the trail. He had made it perhaps 10 miles before the heat and exhaustion killed him. We buried him there in the desert, the best we could without proper tools. Sarah died 3 weeks later, of a fever. I could not save her, though God knows I tried. I buried her too, along the trail, and I marked her grave with stones so that maybe someday someone will know she existed. I made it to a settlement eventually, more dead than alive. A family took me in, nursed me back to health. I worked for them for 2 years, saving money, trying to find the strength to go back and look for you. But I was afraid of what I would find, afraid that you had died too and it would be my fault for leaving you. Eventually, I married the man who had saved me. He is kind, patient with my grief and my guilt. We have a small farm in Nevada. I am writing this from my bed because the doctor says I do not have much time left. The same sickness that took Sarah is taking me now. I need you to know that I thought about you every day, that I regretted leaving you every single moment of my life after, that if I could change it, I would. But I cannot change the past, only beg for your forgiveness in whatever time I have left. If you receive this letter, please know that I loved you as best as I could. I was never quite right after you were born, your father told you that, but the love was real, even if I could not show it the way a mother should. I hope you survived. I hope you found happiness. I hope you can forgive me, though I do not deserve it. Your mother, Martha. Marianne read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. When Frank came in for lunch and found her crying at the table, he read it over her shoulder, his hand on her shoulder, solid and steady. "What do you want to do?" he asked when he finished. "I do not know. She is dying." Maybe already dead, this letter took weeks to arrive. What is there to do? You could write back. Tell her you forgive her if that is true, or tell her you do not if that is more honest. Give yourself closure one way or another. Marianne thought about it for a long time. Part of her wanted to write back, to tell her mother she understood, that she had found happiness, that the abandonment had led to a life she would not trade for anything. But another part of her, the part that was still that 19-year-old girl dying of thirst beside a broken wagon, was not ready to forgive. In the end, she wrote a short letter, not full of forgiveness but not full of bitterness either, just honest. "I received your letter. I survived. I am married with 3 children and a good life. I am sorry about Father and Sarah. I hope you find peace. Marianne." She sent it off and tried not to think about whether it would arrive in time, whether her mother would read it, whether it would matter. The letter had opened old wounds, but it had also brought a strange sense of closure. She knew now what had happened to her family. She could stop wondering. That night, lying in bed with Frank's arm around her, she said, "I spent so many years angry about being left behind. But if they had not left me, I would never have met you. Our children would not exist. This life would not exist. Maybe everything happened exactly as it was supposed to." You really believe that? I am trying to. I think it is easier than believing it was all random chance and suffering. "Either way," Frank said, pulling her closer, "I am grateful for whatever brought you to me. Even if it was tragedy and loss and bad luck, I am grateful. So am I." As the children grew older, the ranch changed with them. Thomas at 16 was nearly as tall as his father and twice as wild, always pushing boundaries, always testing limits. He talked about seeing the world beyond Utah, about adventure and excitement and things bigger than cattle and hay. Frank listened patiently to these dreams, never dismissing them, never demanding Thomas stay and work the ranch. "A man has to find his own path," he told Marianne when she worried. "If his path takes him away for a while, we have to let him go. If it is meant to, he will come back." Caroline at 13 was already beautiful, with boys starting to notice despite Frank's best efforts to glare them away. But she was also smart, smarter than anyone Marianne had ever known, reading everything she could get her hands on and dreaming of becoming a teacher. And James at 5 was pure joy, curious and loving and constantly underfoot, asking a million questions about everything. Watching them grow, watching them become their own people, was both thrilling and terrifying. Marianne understood now why her own mother might have struggled with motherhood, with the weight of responsibility and love and fear all tangled together. But unlike her mother, Marianne had Frank beside her, sharing the burden, making it bearable. They were not perfect parents. They made mistakes, lost their tempers, failed to understand what their children needed sometimes. But they loved fiercely and showed up every day, and in the end that was what mattered. On a summer evening in 1897, when Marianne was 39 and Frank was 43, they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Caroline to rope, while James ran in circles around them with the dog barking at his heels. "We did good," Frank said quietly. "We did," Marianne agreed. "Thank you for building this life with me, for saying yes when I asked you to stay, for being brave enough to love me." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you for finding me, for saving me, for giving me a home when I had nothing. You gave me a home too. Before you, this was just a place I lived. You made it a home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, watching their children laugh and play, counting their blessings. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Henry Patterson died in 1899, and they grieved with Dorothy, who had been such a good friend through all the years. Thomas left home at 18 to work on a cattle drive to Montana, and Marianne cried for a week despite knowing it was what he needed. He came back 6 months later, taller and quieter and ready to settle down, ready to help build the ranch into something bigger. Caroline went to Salt Lake City to attend normal school, studying to become a teacher just as she had dreamed. She wrote home often, long letters full of ideas and excitement about her studies. When she graduated and took a position teaching in Parowan, Frank cried, though he tried to hide it. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch more than either of his siblings, who wanted nothing more than to work beside his father and someday inherit the land they had all worked so hard to build. In 1905, Thomas married a girl named Rebecca from Parowan, and they built a small house on the northern section of the ranch. The first grandchild arrived a year later, a boy they named Frank, and watching his namesake grandson took years off Frank's face, made him smile in ways Marianne had not seen in a long time. Caroline married in 1907, a schoolteacher like herself, and they moved to Cedar City where they both taught. She gave them 2 granddaughters in quick succession, both beautiful and bright-eyed like their mother. James, in no hurry to marry, focused on learning every aspect of ranch management, preparing himself to take over when Frank was ready to step back. Through it all, Frank and Marianne grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies slowing, but their love as constant as the desert sun. They had arguments, of course, moments of frustration and misunderstanding. But they always came back to each other, always remembered what they had built and why it mattered. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1908, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There was food and music and laughter, the house full to bursting with family. Marianne looked around at all of it, at the life that had grown from that moment in the desert when Frank had found her dying, and she could barely comprehend the journey that had brought her here. After everyone had gone home and they were alone again, Frank took her hand and led her outside. The stars were brilliant overhead, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her away from the house, out into the pasture where the grass grew tall and soft. And there, in the middle of the field, he had built a bench, simple but solid, positioned to face east toward the rising sun. "I made this for us," he said. "A place to sit and watch the morning come. I figured we have earned the right to slow down a bit, to enjoy what we built instead of always working." Marianne sat down on the bench, running her hand over the smooth wood. "It is perfect." Frank sat beside her, and they looked up at the stars together, the same stars that had watched over them through decades of love and work and raising children, through droughts and good years and everything in between. "If you could go back," Frank asked, "and change what happened, would you? Would you save yourself from being left behind, join a different wagon train, live a different life?" Marianne thought about the girl she had been at 19, scared and alone and dying in the desert. She thought about the grief and loss that had brought her to this point. And she thought about everything that had come after, this man beside her, their children, their grandchildren, this life they had built from nothing. "No," she said firmly, "I would not change a single moment, because every moment, good and bad, led me here, led me to you. And I would walk through the desert 1,000 times if it meant finding you at the end of it." Frank pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I love you, Marianne Norton. I have loved you from the moment I saw you beside that broken wagon. I will love you until the day I die and beyond if God allows it. I love you too, my lonely cowboy who became my home." They sat together on the bench as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who had found each other in the vast emptiness and created something beautiful together. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and dust and possibility. Inside the house, lamps glowed warm and golden. In the barn, the horses shifted and settled for the night. Across the ranch, in the small house to the north, their son and his family slept soundly. In Cedar City, their daughter tucked her children into bed. And there on the bench, Frank and Marianne held each other close and counted their blessings. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Frank did less of the heavy work, letting Thomas and James handle most of it, though he still insisted on helping with the horses because that had always been his favorite part. Marianne spent her days gardening, sewing, and spoiling her grandchildren when they visited. They became fixtures in the community, the old couple who had built their ranch from nothing, who had raised fine children and contributed to the growth of the region. People came to them for advice, for help settling disputes, for the wisdom that only comes from living a long life with integrity. In 1912, Frank's health began to fail. His heart, the doctor said, it was giving out after too many hard years and too much work. He was 68, Marianne was 54, and the prospect of losing him was unbearable. But Frank faced it with the same quiet strength he had brought to everything else in life. "I have had a good run," he told her one evening as they sat on their bench watching the sunset. "More than I ever expected. A wife I adored, children who made me proud, a ranch that will outlast me. No man could ask for more." "I am not ready to lose you," Marianne said, tears in her eyes. "I know, but when the time comes, I need you to be strong. For the children, for the grandchildren, keep this place going, tell them stories about me, do not let them forget. Never." I could never forget a moment of our life together. Frank died on a cool morning in October with Marianne holding his hand. His last words were "thank you for staying." The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. After 34 years of marriage, of building a life together, half of herself was suddenly gone. The ranch felt empty without him, the bed too big, the mornings too quiet. But Marianne did what Frank had asked. She stayed strong for their children, helped plan a funeral that celebrated his life rather than mourning his death. She told stories about him to the grandchildren, making sure they knew what kind of man their grandfather had been. And slowly, day by day, she learned to live in a world without him. Not to move on, because she would never truly move on, but to keep living, to honor his memory by maintaining what they had built together. Thomas took over running the ranch with James's help. Both sons were good men, hardworking and honest, carrying on their father's legacy. Caroline visited often, bringing her daughters, filling the house with feminine energy that Marianne had not realized she was missing. The grandchildren grew, and great-grandchildren arrived, each new generation a testament to the life Frank and Marianne had created. She told them all the story of how she met their grandfather, about being left behind in the desert and the lonely cowboy who had saved her, who had given her a home when she had nothing. "It sounds like a fairy tale," one of her granddaughters said. "It was better than a fairy tale," Marianne replied, "because it was real." Marianne lived another 15 years after Frank died, watching the ranch continue to thrive, watching her family grow and spread like roots reaching deep into the Utah soil. She spent her final years in the house they had built together, surrounded by memories and love and the knowledge that she had lived a life that mattered. On a warm spring morning in 1927, Marianne passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 69. She was buried beside Frank on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under the big sky they had both loved so much. Her children gathered for the funeral, along with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a whole crowd of people who existed because a lonely cowboy had gone looking for a lost calf and found a dying girl instead. They told stories about her strength, her kindness, her determination never to give up even when giving up would have been easier. And in the years that followed, the Norton Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story that had started with abandonment and salvation in the desert. The bench Frank had built remained in the pasture, weathered by time but still solid, a monument to love that had endured. The story became family legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart was a simple truth. Two lonely people had found each other in the wilderness, had chosen to build something together, and in doing so had created a legacy that would outlast them both. They had been lucky, perhaps. Or perhaps it was fate, or divine intervention, or simply the random collision of need and opportunity. But whatever force had brought them together, they had made the most of it, turning tragedy into triumph, abandonment into belonging, loneliness into love. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the hardship or the loss or the years of struggle, but the love they had found, the life they had built, and the family they had created that would carry their story forward into the future, generation after generation. A testament to the power of choosing hope in the face of despair, choosing love when it would have been easier to stay alone, choosing to stay when everything said to leave. The desert still stretched to every horizon, red and harsh and beautiful. But where Frank and Marianne Norton had chosen to make their stand, life had taken root and flourished, proving that even in the most unlikely places, love could not only survive but thrive, creating something permanent and good from the most temporary and desperate of beginnings. Their story was the story of the West itself, brutal and beautiful, demanding and rewarding, a place where loss and gain were separated by the thinnest of margins, where a single choice could change everything, where home was not a place you found but something you built with your own hands and your own heart, one day at a time together.